welcome to the weekly conversations I'm having with my dad about his early history in the computing industry. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of mentorship, both in his life and in general for the other people who were involved in the early personal computing. So welcome. Yeah.
Thank you.
So when I said that we should talk about this today, you said that your answer will probably surprise me. How will your answer surprise me?
So I'm a believer in the fundamental concept of mentors, but people toss that term around willy-nilly without having any idea what's really involved. So that's a little bit of the surprise. And I learned that because my first, and I'd have to say only mentor, that's probably the other surprising part, is a fellow who's passed away now, but was the editor at my first real job, which was a magazine called Marine Business. And then he was also the editor at Inc. magazine, and I followed him from one to the other. And he taught me how to be an editor, how to think as an editor, and in a way that just no one had ever communicated to me previously. And he took it seriously, and he was kind of a jerk. You know, he had a lot, I wouldn't call it discipline, but he was kind of a hard head about the whole thing. And so he would either spike my stories or keep sending them back to me. And part of teaching me about editing was also how to edit people, and not just the lining the words and recomposing the language, but to how to deal with people. And so just a denouement of that was at Inc. While he was the editor, I was the features editor, and a guy that worked for me was a guy named Lucian Rhodes,
Yep.
Right? And one of my lifetime friends. And so I've known him for 45 years, basically, since before I got into the computer industry. And the relationship that we developed was with me being his editor, with my mentor, Paul Kellum, as my editor. And the whole translation that happened, I won't go into the personal details, but Lucian and I really got to know each other, and that's persisted now through the last 45 years. So that relationship of mentor to mentee is really significant and shouldn't be bandied around because it's too valuable. And since then, I have not had any mentors. I felt like I was sufficiently mentored, whatever you want to call it, by Paul, that I learned what I needed to know to learn the rest of the skills that I've acquired since then.
For editing and writing and maybe doing business. But then when you made a transition from a journalist to a venture capitalist, I remember you said that someone told you that you would make a good venture capitalist. Wouldn't that be an instance of being of a mentorship, or would it be just like a guide, basically?
Yeah, that's more just kind of guessing the pattern, right? That wasn't an involved commitment to help me understand that, but I did understand it. And there are parallels. The parallel is functionally that you're doing pattern recognition and using that pattern recognition to either write a story or whatever, or to make an investment. The difference between those two activities, though, is when I write a story, or even if I'm an editor on a publication, the issue of the publication or the story gets published and I no longer have any involvement with that subject. Whereas as a venture capitalist, I invest in somebody and then I own shares in their company and they're stuck with me and I'm stuck with them for quite a long period of time. And the functional difference is, as a writer, I was paid, I've said this many times, but so it sounds a little glib, but I was paid not to make money, i.e. there were conflict of interest rules that prevented me from writing about that which I know the most, the things that I would, in theory, be able to profit from. And but as an investor, I'm paid to make money. I'm paid to make a lot of money. I'm not just paid to make a little bit of money, because you can do that in the stock market or other places. But a venture capitalist is supposed to be out on the extreme of the money-making scale, which is a whole different thing. So,
And then, so you didn't learn that from anyone. You had no mentors. How did you learn how to be a venture capitalist? Was that a hard learning experience?
So as you know, and I'll say, my first experience as a venture capitalist was a partner at New Enterprise Associates, or NEA, in 1996. And I didn't really have a partner that adopted me there. There was one. He's also passed away. Maybe my mentors have a tendency to die on me, but and not to make a joke out of that, but you do have to find somebody that's older than you are, more experienced, if you're going to have a real mentor. And it wasn't just him, fellow named Art Marks. But in general, the partners said to me, the technical part of being a venture capitalist is pretty easy to learn. How to compose a term sheet, what the back and forth is between you and the entrepreneur, and understanding how to develop that relationship. The hard part is picking companies to invest in that actually then make you money, because it's absolute. You're controlled by your numbers. And so at NEA, I had a good track record, not an outstanding one. I made almost 3x the money that I invested at NEA, which was good enough for me to start Alsop Louis with Gilman, and persuade people that I could do better, which we have done better so far. But that process of learning that, there's nobody can tell you how to do that, because everybody that does it successfully has a different way of doing it. So if you talk to Mike Moritz, or you talk to John Doerr, you talk to Dick Kramlicker, all these people who have great track records, and find out how they choose deals, every one of them is different. So there's no pattern that you can determine.
And it seems like a little bit like there could be an analogy to gardening, but even the time scales are so much longer, because you put something in the ground, it'll come up in about 6 to 7 months. I imagine it would be like gardening before we knew what science had to say about gardening. We just kind of put things into the ground and then they magically appear and stuff like that. But it's over a 10-year period, basically.
I have no green thumb. Is that what they call it? In fact, my thumbs are black. I look at plants and they die out of fear. So it's very hard for me to use gardening as a analogy for this. And you can plant something and have it come to fruition within one season. So not totally. The whole theory of farming, where you establish a business based on what you can get out of the ground, that takes much longer. And I've always been fascinated by wine, not just because I want to drink it, which is true, but when you plant a new vineyard, if you actually start with new rootstock and then plant vines on top of that rootstock, the process of where you decide to plant it and what you decide to plant to knowing whether you have a successful crop or not is about 10 years. So it's like when you start a vineyard, this is why vineyards are an excellent place to park money, because you don't get started easily. They start very small, or if you're going to have a full-on vineyard, you have to have a lot of money.
So this brings up an interesting question. What is your relationship to risk? Because you're risking a lot of your money and your investors' money into these different companies, but then you're not just risking it willy-nilly. You have a thesis and everything like that. What is your relationship to risk, and how does it show up in your life?
It's terrible to be a venture capitalist if you don't want to take risk. It's kind of built into the model, but there are quite a few people that appear to think that way. So I embrace risk. I welcome risk. We as a partnership look for risk. We can talk about this for quite a long time, as you have to define what risk is, and it's relative to what your own perceptions are about, what's safe and not safe, and where you take chances. But in our partnership, we avoid deals that are safe, because by definition, the level of risk you take is related to how much reward you can get. So if you only invest in safe deals and you still lose a percentage of them, on average, you're not going to make as much money. And as I mentioned earlier, a venture capitalist job is to make a lot of money, not just a little bit of money. So in that context of having to make a lot of money in order to be a well-known venture capitalist who continues to raise new funds. You have to take risk. And so in our mind, that means that when we look at an investment, we cannot rationally justify it. So we look for deals that we can't justify. And you sit there and it becomes mind-bending because you can go and it's like, where's the end of the universe? Well, it keeps looping back on you. It's so that is risk right there, because you're basically saying I'm going to invest in something where I don't know what the outcome will be.
And then what do you get what is that feeling that you get when you do decide to make an investment? If you do have a pattern for when it shows up, is it in the first meeting, or how do you, and I mean, maybe this isn't even a good question because the only answer is going to be a rational one, and the rational ones might not be the ones that are like, you might not even be able to talk about it, but yeah.
That's the problem is if you can explain it, it comes out of reason. And so to be honest, I look at a lot of deals that are done. There's one that just raised a huge amount of money called Joby for an air taxi. And I think the lead was Toyota or somebody like that. And so it's a car company. Car companies are like going, what do we do in the future? And so that's a small investment from their point of view to see if they can find a new business. That's a different assessment of risk. But to make flying cars, they're probably going to use all that money because, cars are complicated to make. And, generally speaking, costs billions of dollars to invest in a new factory. And Toyota, whoever it is used to that, making capital decisions like that. But I can't figure out how the venture capitalists justify that, because you take $500 million and you put it in a company. Well, how do you get back, 10 billion, which happens sometimes, but not very frequently. So I can't work that one out, which means that maybe that's what I should be doing, because it's not rational.
Interesting. Well, and this kind of reminds me of a few conversations I've had over the last week. I was interviewing a nuclear engineer, and they're doing advanced reactor designs, and I asked her what the timeline is, and it's like, in the late 20s, early 30s, they might have a prototype. But then after that, it could be like, huge in terms of cost savings and ability to provide a base load of power infrastructure for the other alternative ones, which would maybe help us out a lot and also be a way to make a lot of money. But that's like 15 years out. And like, what is your thinking on that in terms of things that are so far out, but could actually be, because there are going to be crazy, unless we have an apocalypse, we're going to have crazy technological and innovation in the next 20 years, right?
Because we need it. The venture world, that's referred to as a science project, because you really don't know what the outcome will be. You don't even know if the technology will work. We always start with the technology, whatever it is. And that's why we're the geek and the gadfly. The geek can figure that out. And generally speaking, he's right. Sometimes it takes a little longer than he thought it would, but he's pretty skeptical. So he's a great filter, right? Because then we get through that gate, and then we go, you have to consider all the other possibilities. And the one thing you can count on is your companies will surprise you. And so whatever you think is going to happen is not actually what's going to happen. This is why reason doesn't help you out. So you have to bet on the idea and the people and your own perception of what that opportunity is. And then you work with them and hope to God it works out.
So let's take this back. I'm going to go all the way back to the mentorship, but I want to first go back to the journalism. How is it different or similar when you're choosing what story to write or how to edit a piece?
You mean the difference between writing and editing?
So the difference between writing and editing is one category, and then in choosing which company to invest in, because both of them you were writing about companies, and then you went from writing about companies to investing in companies.
Well, one basic level is I worked at InfoWorld, which was weekly, right? And so I'd write a column every week. I was beyond being a reporter writing stories for someone else because I was the chief editor. But I had 52 topics to come up with every 51 because we skipped one week. So when you sit there and you go like 51, well, there's no way I'm going to invest in 51 companies. It's possible. Some people have done it on a personal level, not so much as a firm. And I might do 1 or 2 deals a year as a professional, and maybe a few angel deals as well. So the scale is different, right? And so the commitment for any one unit is also different. And so the process for writing a story or editing a package or whatever would be based on perception and intuition. The actual investment in writing the story is not that great. But in that context, if you perceive something that other people haven't seen yet, you have an effect on them and contribute to their understanding. And that's the payoff, right? It happens in a very short cycle. So you don't have to spend a lot of time on it. And that's why I say intuition and perception, as long as you can kind of justify the reason for writing the story in the first place, which again, like venture investments, I read a lot of stories where I go, oh, what the heck were they trying to come up with here? They still published it, even though it didn't work. And that's an editor failure. You should have stuck to the story rather than bothering the reader with it. But and so, I do 1 or 2 investments a year, and probably 1 a year going forward, just because I'm tired of investing in crappy companies. So I'd like to only invest in really successful companies. I wish I could tell.
Yeah, wouldn't everybody?
Yeah.
So then what was the biggest lesson, and that might be it right there, but what was the biggest lesson you learned from your mentor? What is Paul, right?
Paul Kellum, yeah.
Paul Kellum, yeah.
Well, the thing that he drilled into me was, you're not writing the story for yourself. You're writing it for a reader. So you have to understand who the reader is and what their context is, so that when you write the story. And then he gave me a structure. And that structure is the thing that I resisted mightily when he was hammering it into me. But you have to have a story has to have a theme. In other words, there's a thesis in the story that leads you to decide whether to put stuff in it or out of it. And then it has to have a lead. You have to develop the thesis, and then you have to have a conclusion. I mean, I still remember this 40 plus years later, and I still use it. That's why I can't quite figure out how to write a book, because does that still apply when you're writing 80,000 words instead of 800 or even 5,000? Does it have the same structure? And I've read books where I've gone, actually, I think it does. I think it is the same. But at some level, if you write a book that's really tightly focused and the thesis is tight, you don't really have to read the whole book. You just read the first chapter and you get the sense of the whole book.
Well, I think that's accurate, but then there's another piece to it, which is the way that our memories work. The benefit that I found to reading books, which most people don't realize, is something called spaced repetition, where if an article you're going to read once in the day, or if it's really good, you might read it a year later or something like that. But with a book, you're spending time with that book for over a month, and the author makes the same points over and over and over again. And because you have time to forget that point and then re-remember it, it strengthens the memory. And so over the book, it seems like it's more of it's like a longer term relationship with
the content. But the problem I have is that once I recognize the pattern, I'm bored. I don't want to read the rest of the book. So frequently, and a lot of the books I'm really into start this way. This kind of book is written as an article, and then it shows up as really popular. The guy Malcolm Gladwell, or there's a bunch of New Yorker writers that have followed this pattern where they write a story in the New Yorker. Everybody goes, "Wow, that's really good. You should write a book." I think that's kind of what happens. But and then they write a book, and it turns out they're really good at it, and they develop a reputation. And rather than being a poor, struggling writer at the New Yorker, they end up being a very successful author that sells books and makes a lot of money.
That's really interesting. Now I want to dig deeper into why. I mean, I guess we're going to figure it out because we're going to turn these into a book, but
or not.
We're not.
We're going to actually do that and have that book sell.
Yeah.
before we'll figure that one out.
Yeah. But what is the point of writing a book? Why would you rather write a book? This is a question I've asked on Twitter before, because Twitter essentially seems like little tiny snippets of content that you can serve the same purpose of that memorization thing if you curate your people who you're following enough. But then why write a book? And what is the relationship between writing on Twitter and writing a book? Because a lot of people now create followings on Twitter and then write the book. And so like, but what is that point of having that book? Is a really interesting question. But,
Yeah, I'd say that's a way of, it's a way of sort of formalizing an insight that you've had in an article. But
yeah.
not everybody writes an article first. A lot of people write books. I read a pair of books which I think are fascinating. I'm still engaged in the thought process. And one's called The Last Lobster, and the second one is called The Sex Life of Lobsters. They came out within like months of each other, and they complete a story between the two of them. The Last Lobster is more about climate change. Now it's moving the center point of lobster harvesting further and further north. So it's having an impact on all the towns in Maine, the ones that are losing the lobsters and the ones that are gaining them. And then the other book really is about the sex life of lobsters and how they procreate, which is kind of nasty. And it's a tough book to read because the men really treat the women very poorly. You sit there and you have thoughts about what that means. Anyway, so both of those books were written by, each of those books was written by a different person who was really into lobsters, right? That topic. And they took the first one, and The Last Lobster, was really written more by a reporter who kind of got onto this idea that the towns are changing as the center point moves north. The other one is written by a Woods Hole researcher that did the research on how lobsters reproduce. And so each one of them had their own style about it. And they're very well written books. They really engage you. And I managed to finish both of them, which is unusual. Attention span, it's relatively short.
This brings up the question: is is the format of the book and the length of a book a holdover from a period where technology was very different? And a new question, which is, what is the effect of modern media communications on the structure and importance of books?
Well, as you know, I have an opinion on everything, but I think it's had no impact because the concept of a book exists independent of its physical form. And I think Kindle has proved this. If you read a book, you're reading something that is composed in a way that is it's bookness. It's not articleness. It's not tweetness. It's a bookness, and it doesn't really matter whether it's printed or on a computer or something else. Even it's the sort of total concept. And you write something in somewhere between 50 and 100,000 words. It has to have an organization to it that leads you through that book and gives you a satisfying experience. And so the last word is the key thing. Is that what we understand now, which was probably true when Gutenberg invented the first book, that books are an experience. It's not just the form, it's the emotional and intellectual process of going through the book and being affected by it.
This brings to mind a word from Sanskrit that I learned from Sanskrit, which is rasa, the emotional flavor. So every experience has an emotional flavor, and now I can tie that back out to a book has an emotional flavor, and that book, as you said, the bookness has a different emotional flavor than a tweet, and then a different one than a movie, and a different one from an interview. So that's why self-awareness is really important, to understand what is going on right now and why am I doing this? What is the purpose of all of these things that I'm doing? I think interesting. Yeah. So, and then going back to the mentorship angle, you mentioned he had some sort of tough love. What is your relationship to tough love? Either receiving it from that mentor. Were there any other people early on in your career who also gave you tough love? And what is the difference between tough love and being an asshole? For just being an asshole for asshole's sake, or jerk?
Well, it's good you put that one in because I want to talk about Steve Jobs. But the first part of it is the tough love you should get is from your parents. you being my child know that you didn't get that from me or your mother. None of you did. And that's the sort of core part of parenting, is that you create structure for a kid while they're growing up, while still communicating that you care for them and love them. And I only learned this much more recently than you were born. And I've tried to communicate that to you, but but I didn't learn that from my parents, and I'm pretty sure they didn't learn it from their parents. And so it was a condition of the family, that there was none of that in the parenting cycle. So that should be the first level of tough love. And I see this in other parents, mostly mothers, who understand that intuitively and give their kids that sense of structure plus love. And so if you don't get it when you're a kid, you have to find it somewhere else. And that was, to be honest about Paul Kellum, it was a little bit of, he paid attention to me. He wouldn't let me get away with stuff. So he made me see what the structure was and the boundaries were. But he's really the only one that ever did that for me personally. But once he'd done it and I'd seen the connection between that sort of tough love and the benefit, the outcome, in terms of how people read my articles and looked at the publications I edited, then I began to be able to recognize it on my own. And that's really the critical part, is you really need to be taught how to see it yourself and how to modify yourself as a result of that. And that's where Steve Jobs comes in. I certainly didn't know this when I met him, because I met him shortly after I worked with Paul Kellum. So it's like he'd moved on to a different publication. I was still at Inc., and that's when I met Steve. And that was early on, but I realized after some time, and really probably mostly after he died, how important he ended up being to me, because he represented a point of view and a relationship between a company and a customer that I identified as really important. And so I got that, not because he mentored me or anything like that, but I identified him as a person of interest, and I figured out what that interest was and ended up being able to build it into my point of view, although I couldn't possibly do what he did. And the example I've given to people more recently is, well after he died, that part of the product management problem at Apple is they don't have that intuitive sense anymore. And so they're making rational decisions that are by consensus. And there's this feature they introduced in the iPhone called Force Touch, where the theory is great. If you press harder, it does something different than if you don't press as hard. But Steve would have recognized instantly that would complicate the usage of the phone, because you don't really know how hard you have to press, and there's no visual or tactile feedback on it, because it's just a piece of glass. And
quite a few people have tensional issues in their hands that allow them not to. Makes it hard for a lot of people to understand how hard you're pushing on something.
Handicapped or disabled people, and I've shaken a lot since I had to take meds. This is how I figured it out. I had to figure it out, years after the fact. But I'm pretty sure that Steve Jobs would have heard if he'd even listened. And this is where you asked about how does this relate to being an asshole. He would have heard the pitch from the product manager or the feature guy or however they developed that stuff at Apple. And he would have reacted, "You're fired, get out of here." Because he would recognize instantly that the person that was thinking this through was not thinking about the customer. They were thinking about competitive advantage and all that other stuff. And so that's what ties it back together. And I would use that point of view in my newsletter and my columns to give people a hard time publicly. And that's a lot of where my reputation came from.
And so then what is the difference between that? Well, I guess that's being an asshole so that you can love the customer in a way. So it develops the relationship between the customer and essentially what you're saying is the customer is the most important thing that any company has. And then did Steve Jobs have a sort of tough love, or was it because, what's that?
You mean him personally, or did he? I mean, he was tough love. That's why everybody referred to him as an asshole. He'd yell at people, and you know, after a while, you'd figure out what he was talking about. And this is why his team was so loyal to him. While he was in his latter part of his career at Apple, um, he put together a team and they worked for him for 15 years, no matter, and they were all the same people. And, it, you know, he could yell at them, but they all knew that he was trying to accomplish something. And they believed more in that than they did in personal comfort.
Which is very interesting, and that gets into the nature of like love, because that talks about, that's like loyalty, and that has an aspect of love as well, but it's not the popular understanding of love, which is like all gooey and everything
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
So Gilman introduced me to a book called The Me Generation after I had a particular experience in one of my companies with a very young founder. And I'd never read it. I'd heard the term, The Me Generation. A great book, though, because it basically outlines how an entire generation of parents, to the ones that come after us, right? So we were inattentive. These parents were like the helicopter parents. They would like care for, you were always right, and they would take care of everything for you.
Mm-hmm.
So the generation of kids that grew up in that environment had no concept of negative feedback and can't handle it. So if you yell at them, they get all pissed off at you and resentful. And you know, I'm obviously don't have a high opinion of that because I think it makes them more vulnerable and less capable. So I now look out for that when I'm working with a young entrepreneur.
When it seems like I was on the tail end of that, because I do, and as you were saying that, it was like I remember having certain kind of like where you know, where you guys would yell and everything like that, but then I would remember hearing something about, oh no, parents aren't supposed to yell, and it was kind of in the air when I was a kid that no, what you guys were doing was wrong when you were yelling and everything like that. And I think there is some point to that, but then it went over too far.
Well, it's and yes, you're what do we call it? A young millennial or an old millennial? Anyway, you were born right at the transition between whatever that generation is and the millennial generation. But it is the beginning of the millennial generation. It is the me generation where they can do no wrong. You know, soccer games, youth soccer games, nobody lose. You go like, that's not actually the way things happen. It's like, you know, there are winners and losers, and you have to learn to deal with that.
It's very interesting. I had more questions. Oh yeah. So have you ever used tough love with any of the companies that you invest in, or what is the mentorship aspect of investing? Is there a mentorship aspect of investing, or is it different?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Yes, I have used tough love. I've fired CEOs, and I'm pretty good at it. Right? I can. You'd have to talk to the CEOs or founders that I've fired to find out if they agree. But generally speaking, you know, I talk to them afterwards, and after they've gotten some perspective, they tend to agree. So yeah, it's not always a mentor relationship. I mean, there's always a relationship between an investor and the founder / CEO of the company, and there should be. If there's not a relationship, then the venture capitalist is not a very useful person. And so I have a tendency to get in people's face and communicate very directly with them. In fact, Gilman and I have both talked about this, where he's much better at it than I am, right? Because I have a tendency to be too much in someone's face and too challenging, and he kind of works his way around and kind of gets them into the right frame of mind. And here's the irony: is that the entrepreneurs that I end up mentoring tend to be the entrepreneurs that are looking for mentors, right? They're leaning into it. And the ones that are not leaning into it, where you have to try to persuade them or talk them into it, much, much harder. Because if you're don't have that orientation towards, well, how do I get to be a better CEO, better entrepreneur, better whatever it is, it's very hard to talk somebody into seeking it out.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think some founders don't have any interest whatsoever in being mentoring, getting feedback? And is there any relationship to them being more successful? What is the relationship between founders who seek feedback and success, and founders who don't seek feedback and success?
No pattern that you can determine.
No.
Is Travis Kalanick? He probably didn't seek mentorship. And what he just did with Uber, the fact that he sold all his stock and left the board, indicates that he's got a point of view about things. And so he just extracted himself from the company completely when he could, which is probably the right thing to do, right? Just to disappear with $4 billion. But or this fellow at WeWork at the We Company or whatever. I mean, so you can go through and you can say any one person that exists on a spectrum. And maybe the ones that are earnest and really trying to figure out how to be better entrepreneurs don't end up being wild and crazy like those guys. And so people don't notice them as much. I mean, there are hundreds of companies that have gone public over the last 10 years that are worth, $1 billion to $10 billion that we just don't even think about. Right? The ones we think about are the ones that are really visible, that may be really successful or maybe fail. And even WeWork and Uber, you can't say they failed. It's just that the people that bought stock in the later stages weren't really assessing the risk.
Why are some companies so visible? And why is B2B? And when I ask myself that question, it comes to mind that consumer companies are more visible because they interact with the consumer more. And so journalists can write more stories about them with more previous recognition. So that's all kind of out there in the air. But there are some B2B companies that do go get big. And then what is it that's special about a company that's visible versus a company that's not? Is it just like a matter of them putting more PR, them having more founders who are more famous, or what is the deal there?
It's part of the culture. The culture is usually created by the founder or the founding team. So it's either in the DNA or not. We see this in our portfolio. We have companies that are nearly invisible. It's very frustrating because the CEO or leader of the company doesn't know how to do it, doesn't appreciate it, doesn't put any time or money into it. And you could make sort of broad generalizations that those are more engineers instead of marketing, but that stuff doesn't really play out. And it is a marker for whether a company is more likely to be successful or not. And you can see it in our portfolio where we hire a new CEO and suddenly that company becomes much more visible than it was previously. And then we have companies where we have not hired a CEO, we probably should have, who just continue to be kind of invisible, and their success is just not as clear. And, their ability to find partnerships and to define themselves is not as advanced. And so it is a marker for whether companies are generally speaking more successful or not. I mean, you look at Box or Slack or, these are B2B companies. They're well known because they've done so well. Financial results are part of the deal, but also because, Slack has this great backstory about starting as a game company and then ending up doing Slack or Box or Dropbox or Airbnb or, this whole generation of companies. There's always some kind of backstory, even if their founders aren't that good at being visible.
It's very interesting. You once told me a long time ago that any of the companies that you invested in that didn't have stories usually don't go anywhere. It's the company with a crazy story for, hopefully I can say this, but like Meow Wolf or like, Justin TV, those had really interesting stories when they started. Yeah.
Story, the narrative. I always like to prefer the term narrative, but the narrative is very important. It's part of the culture and the DNA of the company that they know how to articulate their narrative and how they fit into the world. So
it also seems like it's based on the events that actually happened, because there's the narrative, and the narrative is like how you extract what actually happened and put it into something that people can grab onto and kind of matches against maybe other kind of archetypes or myths or anything like that. But then it also seems like there is an actual, something happened really interesting. It wasn't just like a very kind of boring experience of them finding each other as co-founders, or, it was like very in-depth with a lot of drama and a lot of crazy stuff happening.
That's why I referred to Steve Jobs's last 15 years at Apple, because here he was, had the reputation of yelling at people and firing them on the spot. And yet he put a team together, and people didn't really realize this for quite a while, that stuck together and created a culture inside of Apple that was much more focused on performance and than it was on, who's who. And so, I mean, he had one of the great things that he did, and Fortune's the only magazine that actually wrote about it, where he had this idea of the 100 at Apple, and Apple had 20,000 employees, but he picked out 100 people, some of whom are on his direct reports and some of whom were not, didn't have anything to do with him. And he'd have an annual event where he'd bring the 100 to a resort somewhere, and they'd all interact with each other, and he'd kind of listen to that and extract out of that, issues that were important for Apple to deal with. That was a really important and innovative, because there probably was no other company at the time that did that, and maybe it never has been, because you have to have a very strong leader who's willing to reach out into the organization and pull people in. I think that was a really interesting thing that he did.
What is the importance with structure and narrative, or between structure and narrative? Because you mentioned you resisted the structure. I'm curious as to why you resist the structure, because obviously I think that runs in the genes, or you taught me that at an early age, because I also don't really appreciate structure that much either. What is that thing?
I have no idea what the question is you're asking. That was too above my pay grade. That was so I'll have to make the question more precise.
Yeah. So the way I comment, it's a theme that I've been trying to discover for a long time. So when I'll take an analogy for dancing, when I look at somebody dancing 3 years ago, before I started dancing, when I looked at somebody dancing, I was able to look at them and see, wow, that's really interesting that they're doing that. It looks really beautiful. And then they're practicing a form of dancing, like zouk or salsa or anything like that. They're practicing something they've learned for a very long time. And then, and with steps and basic things that you progress from over time. And when I'm looking at them, I don't really understand. I see it as a whole and it's beautiful. And then I go and I try to learn it, and I have to break it down into little steps. And this is where a teacher kind of comes into play. But then it ceases to be an entire whole, and you can break it down into little things. But then at some point, once you learn the structure, you then are able to create a whole again, and you don't need the form anymore. And so what is the relation in a story? What I see a story is basically a lot of things happened. Some of those things are relevant, some of those things are not relevant. And then as a storyteller, you take the things that are relevant and piece them together, even though you can never really fully represent everything that happened. And so what is that? So for me, I see value in not having structure, but then I also see value in structure as well. Did that help kind of?
No, I still have no idea what you're talking about, but there's a meme, still trying to figure out what memes are, but there's a meme out there about if you do anything for 1,000 times, you learn how to do it, right? But if less than that, you don't really learn how to do it. Well, I think part of that addresses what you're talking about, which is, you have to learn something well enough that the structure disappears, because you just do it by rote or muscle memory or whatever it is. And then you can graduate to a different level where you can see past the structure and start to be intuitive about how to be creative, how to move it forward. I think that's kind of what you're talking about. But,
well, and then this takes it back to Paul, because Paul, you mentioned that Paul gave you the structure to the story. Yeah. And so like the question I'm asking is, why do you think that you resisted that so much? I'm sure this gets into like childhood stuff, but like what is it about? I'm trying to figure out for both you and me, because we both have it. And I think my sisters have it as well. And I think a lot of people on the world have it, but it's like, because in some ways I think that ability to be without that structure, without that form, might be reason why you have done the things you've done in your life, because you've been able to push against it. But at the same time, as part of it is I feel like this is the child, like we used to have arguments about this as a kid too, or I used to have an argument with you guys about it when I was a kid.
Yeah. This is the anecdote that I've told in the past, which I think I've told here, but certainly to people individually, which is, I got into psychotherapy for 12 years, and about halfway through, I shared with my therapist that that I felt that anxiety was the reason that I'd been so successful, and he laughed at me, and that's the anecdote I tell. Is I had my shrink laughing at me, and I said to him, I said, "That's you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to be on my side. You shouldn't be laughing at what I tell you." And he said, "Yeah, but what you just said is one of the most laughable things I've ever heard, because first of all, anxiety is not the problem; it's a sign of the problem." And what I came to understand ultimately was it's a function of what your level of self-awareness is. And I had very low level of self-awareness, particularly when I started that psychotherapy versus when I came out of it. And that was part of the process, was to be able to identify myself based on my own self-awareness and confidence in myself, what I bought into, what I believed in or not. And I didn't grow up with that. I didn't have that structure. My father and my mother didn't communicate to me a sense of yes or no. What's interesting, of course, is that your Uncle Joe, my oldest brother, does have it. But it gets weaker and weaker through the siblings. And, this is something for you to consider as number 3 out of 3. The same effect happened, I think, with between your sisters and yourself, just because we paid a lot more attention when our first kid came along. But then over time, we sort of, for whatever reason, partially because our relationship fell apart, but they paid less and less attention to the kids as they came along. Ghost.
So when you first found your mentor, Paul, it wasn't like you never seeked out a mentor.
No, sought
out. Yeah.
I was correcting the English. No, and I just got him because that's who hired me. He hired me, right? He hired me at Marine Business and made me, an editor, and then taught me how to be an editor. And as time went by, I followed him. So I ended up being the editor-in-chief of Marine Business after he went to Inc. And then I ended up being the executive editor at Inc. after, well, partially for him, and then that became a whole nother thing. But I kind of ran the magazine, so he taught me how to run things too.
Está en el teléfono. Sí, ¿puedo hablar contigo más tarde? So, okay, this is probably a good time to wrap up.
The locals want to know what the heck you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you guys for tuning in. We're going to do this every Saturday at 8 a.m. Pacific time. I think we'll be on next week. Yeah, we should be on next week. And then so come join us next Saturday. Yep. Bye.